Thank you for joining the Center for Applied Linguistics this afternoon for this 30-minute webinar entitled In Plain Language, Language Practices for Inclusion and Equity. Also, just want to point out before we begin that Cal is providing this event as a public service. However, the views, thoughts, and opinions expressed solely belong to the persons expressing them and do not necessarily represent the views of the Center for Applied Linguistics. Now I'll get straight to introducing our guests. I'd like to introduce Mr. Anthony Tassi. Anthony is the Chief Executive Officer at Literacy Partners, a New York City-based 501c3 that provides free classes, community workshops, and educational media for local communities to be able to develop the literacy and language skills needed to succeed in today's world. Anthony previously served in the New York City Mayor's Office of Adult Education in the Bloomberg administration, where he also served as a health policy advisor. Throughout his career, Anthony has witnessed firsthand how strengthening adult literacy programs not only improves education outcomes, but has a profound public health impact as well. Anthony, thank you for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
And my other guest today is Dr. Katherine Moran. Dr. Kate Moran is the Director of Adult Language and Communication at the Center for Applied Linguistics. At Cal, Kate creates and delivers professional development for pre-K through 12 educators, as well as oversees the English for Heritage Language Speakers program, which is run out of Georgetown University. She has a background in discourse analysis and corpus linguistics and is interested in register variation, particularly across academic disciplines and content areas. Her most recent publication in Language Magazine, entitled Access and Equity Through Clear Communications, is currently one of the most popular articles on the site, which is kind of what we're talking about today too. Kate, it's such a pleasure to have you today.
Thank you, Trey, for that warm welcome.
Of course. Well, guys, we only have 30 minutes, so let's get right to it. Our topic is plain language. So I'll start with the first question, which is, what is the connection between plain language and language access and equity and justice?
Thanks, Trey. That's a great question. And I think to address this question, we really have to have a good definition of what we mean by plain language. For me, plain language is language that is clear and easy to understand for the people who are using that language. And when we think of this in the context of communication, and particularly communication for the public, we can see how complex language or language from a highly specific register, like language we see in policies, language we see on ballot initiatives, language related to healthcare, or even the language of disclaimers and terms and conditions, it's often not clear and easy to understand for the majority of people who need to use that information, and also for the people for whom that communication is intended. And this is a problem because the burden is often on the person who needs the information to come up with a way to access that information. And that right there increases inequity between those who can and those who cannot access the information. I think plain language is beneficial for everyone, right? Who of us wouldn't prefer communication that's organized and written in a way that's clear and easy to understand? And let me toss it over to Anthony and get his opinion on this.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Kate. When you think about plain language, it's essentially what we're talking about is clear and effective communication. So as you say, it's really good for everyone because it improves the quality of your communication. It helps you achieve your goals. And I think it's one of the most powerful and simplest tools to advance equity. Because if you think about it, language has been a tool that's really been used to exclude people from resources, from the dominant discourse or what have you. And plain language, clear and effective communication is a very powerful tool of inclusion. So any school district or hospital system or public or nonprofit entity that has an equity initiative should really think about plain language, should think about how we are communicating to the public, on whose terms are we communicating to the public, who are we bringing in with our language and who are we excluding?
Yeah, I really like those definitions that you're putting together for us to paint this picture, and bridging the gap between, what is this movement and what are we talking about with access and equity? You mentioned before the onus has typically been on the public to understand. So I wonder in a practical application in the real world, so to speak, what are some of the pain points, I guess, that K through 12 practitioners, people in schools might face that plain language can help address? So I'm thinking you're constantly communicating with parents, teachers, caregivers, guardians, other staff members. So what are those pain points and how could plain language kind of help address that? Do I throw it to Kate or Anthony?
Sure, I can start this one. So Trey, I think there are a lot of pain points when we're talking about the K-12 realm, right? But if yeah, a few of them are that if communication is clear and easy to understand for the target users, in this case, that's often parents and caregivers, that schools are going to see fewer follow-up questions, more parents and caregivers able to get the information they need and use it in a meaningful way, which leads to more engagement and also more inclusion in the school community. There's a study that shows that using plain language actually increases trust in an organization because the users of that communication now feel like the organization is being transparent with them. So would help increase engagement. And because plain language is inclusive, it's going to help parents and caregivers feel welcomed rather than put off by confusing language that's difficult to understand. And one more point is also easing the burden of translation. So many of our documents in K-12 are translated into many, many different languages. And when the communication is written in plain language to start with, then translation is a lot easier because there's less open to interpretation.
Mm-hmm. Anthony?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on that last point, Kate. I think that's so true. You know, I think where we're trying to go with all of this, right, where our destination is multilingualism, right? It's institution. I mean, it's society as a whole, but it's really our educational institutions, our other social service programs that are truly multilingual, that respect and acknowledge and engage the heritage languages, the home languages, et cetera, and don't assume that the dominant language is the preferred or the correct or the standard or the norm, right? But obviously, we're not there yet. In most, if not, in many cases, we're not at that place yet. And so, along the way, language access mandates and executive orders and laws that require school districts, healthcare providers, and others to translate essential information into the languages that people speak. That's been a major step in the right direction. And one of the most important barriers in implementing those mandates has been that the English original, yes, we're still in a place where things are drafted in English and are translated into other languages, but the English original is too hard to understand. So the skilled translators are looking at a document that has all kinds of jargon, that has passive sentences where it's not clear who's doing the speaking, and too many clauses. And so that's adding errors into the translated document. And so we saw in New York, for example, the mayoral executive order on language access stipulated that agencies had to produce the documents in plain language first, and had to go through a series of trainings, simple trainings. It's not rocket science. There's some art and some science, but everybody can do it, and you can find a way to create your content in English, but in English that is very clear and doesn't have any jargon in it. And has simpler ways, more conversational tone to it, that can be translated more effectively because the translator can understand it to begin with.
Yeah, and I wanted to bring up that point to you again, Anthony. When plain language isn't like considered or incorporated into we'll say a communique in general, whether it's a memo or an all staff email or a school-wide email, what are some of the things that can happen? Do you have any examples of this?
Do we have examples? How much time do we have?
How much time? We only have 30 minutes, so let's just go with maybe one.
Well, no, I run an adult literacy program for parents. So my teachers are doing this day in and day out, dealing with the consequences of lack of plain language, where our students can't make any sense of the documents. But the example that comes to mind is from my personal life. My middle school age daughter received communication at the beginning of the school year. Now, I'm not going to name the district, but somebody had this really clever idea of branding the reopening of the public schools. We're no longer doing remote, we're no longer doing hybrid, everybody's in person. So they branded it and communicated to all the parents, including me, a public school parent, about homecoming 2021. And I looked at the document and I was like, homecoming? What does that mean? And it was especially perplexing because I think of school as someplace my daughter goes to, whereas they have homecoming. Like, what is this? And then after a while of puzzling over this, I realized, there were like some marketing types in some room that all had a frame of reference, maybe from their college days or something, about this cultural tradition called homecoming. And like nobody, it was obviously from on high and it went down and people had to implement it. But, how are people supposed to make sense of that? I mean, if you try to translate it literally, it doesn't mean, that's the school. We go to school and then we come home at night.
Yeah.
It just was.
I feel like trying to translate that into not just the language, but the culture that surrounds and supports the language, that might not exist. So, you have to kind of find that out. So it probably makes it difficult, again, down the line, not just for the receivers of it, but maybe the translators as well, who have to kind of pull something out of their hat, to use a euphemism, which I would like to pivot, because I'm watching our chat over here and we're getting some great discussion and great questions. And I wanted to bring something up to clarify plain language. Is it spoken? Is it written? Is it both? Could you go towards that? I know that with modes of communication, we have presentational, interpersonal, interpretive. What is plain language approach, and what areas of those modes does it encompass, I guess?
Yeah, I'll start. I think plain language is both spoken and written to start with. And what you're really trying to do is to communicate with the person that you're trying to communicate with on their terms, in language that they would understand. So if your audience, if the people you're trying to help with some document or some piece of it, oral assistance, doesn't have a college degree, for example, and doesn't work in the education field, for example, then you should probably not use any education jargon, and you probably shouldn't use vocabulary common to college graduates. And I think that's actually one of the most interesting things in my journey in plain language, is really recognizing linguistic privilege, right? And so those of us who have been to college just have, it's like we've been enculturated into a way of communicating that privileges more and more complex ideas, more and more abstract ideas, bigger and bigger words, longer and longer sentences, right? And it's the reverse of what's needed in most forms of communication with the general public, right?
Mm-hmm. Kate?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what Anthony's saying there. And yes, I think, in this country, the history of plain language leading up to the Plain Writing Act of 2010 has kind of focused more on written communication. But I will agree that plain language needs to be used in all forms of communication, whether that's spoken or written, or even multimodal forms of communication, like we're seeing now with websites and the way websites are organized, and online information that incorporate videos and things like that. Because as Anthony was talking about language and linguistic privilege, language is also a gatekeeper, right? And it can block access to information. So when we're using overly complex language that's not necessary and maybe not in everyone's domain of understanding, it can block access to even jobs and services through complex forms and applications, but other sorts of important information that that everyone has a right to have access to.
Mm-hmm. And again, going back, it seems like when you say access, it's more than just, I have an internet connection, I can access the material. It's really the accessibility of the language itself, as you said, not using the jargon, but really expanding the definition of what we mean by access when we talk about
it's access, meaning that the intended users can easily use, understand, and use the information in a meaningful way. So that's access. Are they able to get the information that they need from this communication and use it.
Yeah, I was just looking at the chat here, and somebody has wonderfully busted me on my lack of plain language in this presentation. And I think that goes back to, I have been acculturated. And I sort of have I was thinking about the audience here today, and it goes back to your point, Trey, about written versus spoken. And that's the importance of written language. Is if I wrote down what I'm saying here, I would be like, horrified about what it reads on paper. Right. So I would take the time to revise it and turn it into something that's probably more accessible for more people, and actually would meet the needs of all the highly educated people on the webinar better than the kind of language that I'm using and the kind of presentation and discourse I'm engaged in here.
Let me follow up on that, because by the way, we do have closed captioning. So if you want to go back and look over what you said, we can probably figure that out. Although I don't want to go through that nightmare. Halloween's behind us. What I wanted to ask was simply, is how standardized of a practice is this yet? In the United States, in the public school system, in other institutions or areas of professions? And are we talking about something that's brand new? We're talking about something that has a really strict guidelines and sort of rubric for reviewing what is and what isn't plain language. I'm thinking, could I look at my script or my closed captioning and say, wow, I got a 2 out of 10 based on this rubric? How standardized is it? What would you say, Kate?
Well, I would say that level of standardization would be really problematic, because we're no longer now considering our user, right? We're just looking at the language we're producing and deciding without the user's input, without knowing whether they're understanding the communication, whether or not it's accessible. And we can't do that, right? We need to know from the user whether or not they're able to understand and use the communication. So I would say plain language as a movement is not new at all. That goes back decades, possibly a century, and certainly has gained a lot of momentum in the past 20, 30 years in the United States, but also internationally and in languages beyond English. There are plain language movements in languages across the world. Particularly in the legal fields, healthcare fields, but also any areas where people are communicating with the public. But I think the thing to keep in mind is that while we have very effective plain language guidelines in the United States, we have, as a result of the Plain Writing Act of 2010, we have wonderful resources that are available through the federal government, and they have great plain language guidelines, but those guidelines are guidelines. They're not rules. It is not, if I follow these rules, I have created plain language. They're guidelines for things to keep in mind to make your communication more accessible, but without testing it with users who need to use that communication and finding out if they find it easy to use and easy to access, then we can't say that we're using plain language effectively. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, making it too rigid sounds like it's counterintuitive to the whole process to begin with, because your audience will change and evolve over time, and so will the communication. So it does sound like it's not just, you put this press release out one time, like I might as a communications director, and then that's it. But you're reviewing these sorts of communications on a daily basis, it sounds like.
I see a really good question in that chat, Trey, from Deborah, who asked about how do we counteract, the people who say that writing in plain language or using plain language communication is just dumbing down. I would say from a linguistic perspective, actually simplifying or dumbing down a message does not equate to easy to understand and access. It's not about dumbing down the message. It's about creating a message that people can understand and use. And sometimes that doesn't mean that it's shorter sentences or simpler words. Sometimes we need to define the word, or we need to add more context to make a message clearer. So it's definitely not dumbing down, but it's taking that language out of that specific register that only a certain group of people might have access to through specialized knowledge or specialized training or skills, and creating language that is more widely used, that's more accessible and easy to understand by all the people who need to use it.
Yeah, and I see Andrew Pleasant made a really good point in the chat that it's another skill set for people to acquire, the skill to write in a specific tone, voice, and level. Yeah, so I think that's really important to say, that it's not, it's really a strength, you can really think of it as a strength-based approach, right? Like the writer is going to gain new skills in communication. It's not a deficit model. And again, we want to be in a multilingual framework where one person's capacity for written English language, academic English, is not considered, from a normative perspective, superior to someone else's, right? And so I think that that's a great way to frame it, as you're building skills. And for me, writing is revision, right? And nobody, like criticizes a poet because they didn't write a longer poem, or have more words in their stanzas or what have you, right?
Absolutely.
I was just writing down Yeats, so I will read Yeats later for that reason. We have a couple more questions, but I guess we also have a lot of audience questions too. And with only 8 minutes left, I'll jump to the end of our planned questions and ask you both, if you had a magic wand, what changes in policy would you make? Sorry, let me read exactly what I have so it's very direct. What changes in policy would you make so that plain language as a practice might be more impactful or accessible, or just recognized by others?
Kate, you want to kick off?
Sure, I can start. I think that's a great question, Trey, and I'm not sure that the answer lies in more policy. As I mentioned, the Plain Writing Act of 2010 is entering its 12th year, and there have been vast improvements. I saw something in the chat box asking about government communication. There have been improvements in written communication from government agencies as a result of the Plain Writing Act, but there's a lot more work to be done. So I think if I had a magic wand, I would really want to shift the burden of responsibility from the user of the communication to the creator. And make it regular practice to check in with the people who use communication and see if they find it clear and easy to understand. Because the plain language guidelines are wonderful, but for them to be effective, we really need to know more about the user's experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would be happy with stronger federal mandates, and I would be happy for the civil rights architecture of this country to embrace language more consistently and more comprehensively. I would love to see that.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you guys very much for your answers to these questions and your discussion. As you guys are seeing, just as I am, the chat is very active right now. So I'm going to go to our Q&A box. By the way, because the chat is a little bit active, I'm not able to follow everybody's questions. So if you do have a specific question for one of our panelists or for myself, please use the Q&A box to submit that question, because that's where I can read them a little bit easier. Here's a good question, Anonymous. Would you recommend using machine translation for plain language texts? Why or why not?
Well, I would recommend using the readability statistics, like in Microsoft Word or Google Docs. When you go to the spell check, there's an area for readability statistics. And again, plain language is art and science, right? And so the science of it is the fewer words per sentence, the easier the sentence will be to understand. The shorter the words, the fewer syllables in a word, the easier it is to understand. It can't substitute for meaning, but it gives you a general idea of the level. It doesn't tell you if it's clear or not, but it does give you a general idea of the level. So when I write something off the top of my head, I click on readability, it says, 14th grade level, average sentence is 28 words long, and so I know I've got to break those sentences in half or in thirds, and I've got to and that helps me with the revision process to just get in that mindset.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the danger of machine translation or computer automated plain languaging is that maybe it's a good starting place, but I think we also do need to make sure that if we're intending this to be information that's usable, that we are checking in with the users.
Mm-hmm. I can see that why you're sort of offloading onto the computer and asking it, does it understand it? Well, sure, it might, but maybe the user won't. Let's see. Here's a good question, a great question, I should say, from Kelly. She says, in what ways can departments, state departments of ed, for example, incorporate plain language into their memos or when dealing with complex policies or legislation, keeping in mind the audience member that's intended for?
Yeah, I think it's actually a really simple process, and it just starts with getting together a training. Kick off a workshop series for all of the different divisions within your department, and bring in somebody. Plain language folks are typically not very expensive to bring in, but to bring in and do a workshop on plain language. And I know both Kate and I have conducted these workshops. And one of the things that I think we both find all the time is that when you have people together analyzing their own department's documents, they find areas that are just hard to understand. And what it often reveals is that the policy behind the memo is actually kind of muddled. And that's why it's hard to understand. And you often find that people don't feel like they're in charge, that they have the agency within their department to change the language of some document. Oh, legal is going to freak out if we change this. And these are, it's the dynamics of language in the institution and trying to break down the hierarchies and the implied power relations so the language can actually welcome people in, help people accomplish some goal that you have, help people accomplish your mission, right?
Yeah.
One of the, I think Meredith in the chat wrote it down, it's all about the audience. As writers, we're rarely the audience. I got to second that, and CC Root here also is seconding me on that one, because a lot of our questions come, and I'll try to summarize two questions here. Some critics would respond or argue that in education, families want children to learn and use academic language. So when they get into those, when they become sort of those audience members in higher education, for example. So the question I'm trying to boil down a lot here is, what is the line between plain language and what isn't? Can we take complex technical concepts and express them in plain language?
I think there's a couple parts to this question, Trey. One, I think that what constitutes plain language does definitely depend on the intention of the communication and who's using the communication. So if the users of the communication are all within the same field and understand and speak using the same jargon, that's going to look very different than something intended for the public. So it's not to say that academic language doesn't have a place or isn't worth teaching in school, but we do want to be careful about making sure that we are not using language as a gatekeeping mechanism to keep people from being able to access either higher education or certain types of information. There was another part to that, and now it's escaped me. Do you remember the second part of your question?
Yes, I'm scrolling back up. So taking technical or complex topics, I would think medical, things that you would think can't be, they're inextricably linked to the meaning.
Right.
So,
right. And that's a big thing you hear a lot, especially in the legal fields, that we have to say it this way. And Anthony alluded to this as well. Well, we can't change that. It's legal. This is legal language, has to be this way. But there's actually been a lot of work done on plain language in legal fields. And you know what? It doesn't have to be that way. How many of the people on this webinar have been caught up in the automatic subscribe, where you cannot unsubscribe to some service that you've paid for because somewhere in the terms and conditions that maybe you didn't read because they're so long and complex, you agreed that they would automatically keep charging your credit card for a service. If they had that information written in plain language, and that is possible, there's no reason that it should have to be that long, you could make an informed decision about whether you wanted to continue your subscription. Sometimes there are reasons why organizations or certain entities are choosing not to use plain language, and it has nothing to do with whether or not the message could be said in a more direct and accessible way.
But even when you do have to include legal mumbo jumbo in a written document for the public, you can explain it in plain language. You can say, like, this paragraph will tell you what your rights and responsibilities, whatever it is, right? A little short summary. And really, if you can say, if you need help, call so-and-so or email such and such, or go to this website for more information, right? I think those are very helpful tools. We want the document to help people accomplish something, right? I mean, this isn't a webinar for people writing fiction or the great thrillers. This is a webinar for people who are helping the public. And if your agency is hung up on the term plain and plain language, then march forward with clear and effective communication. March forward with equitable communication, because that's really what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to break down barriers, right? And we're trying to, we're trying to do a lot of things and help people to understand their privilege and where their privilege is preventing them from actually achieving the mission that they've signed up to work on.
Mm-hmm. Well, I feel like we've done a lot on this call so far, and we are 2 minutes over our time. And I want to take a moment to thank Kate and Anthony for joining the Center for Applied Linguistics, myself, and everyone who's participating on the call. I would remind you that we will be sending out an update email in about 24 hours with this recording, as well as much of the research and citations and resources that we mentioned on the call in a follow-up email. Sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions, but if you would like to email us, please do. Our email is info@cal.org, and look out for that follow-up email. Anthony, Dr. Moran, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
And thank you to everybody that hit us up in the chat. I'm going to take a few minutes now to go through it. So this has been a very valuable webinar for me. I feel like I'm going to learn much more as I have a chance to go through everybody's comments in the chat. Thanks so much, Trey.
Agreed.
And thanks to Cal for organizing this.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you. Have a great rest of your week, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.